All right. Well, hello everyone and welcome. This is a fermentation webinar. My name is Aaron Essery, Assistant Extension Specialist for Viticulture and Enology here at Oklahoma State University. And today we're going to talk about fermentation. Okay, so this webinar starts at harvest. So we're going to start with harvesting the fruit and we'll end somewhere before barreling. But what is fermentation? So fermentation is what makes wine. Fermentation is the conversion of sugar into alcohol via yeasts. Many different types of yeasts. I'll talk about that later. For winemaking, there's three main liquids. I don't know. There's the juice, which is juice. It's just non-alcoholic juice derived from grapes. That's juice. Must is grape juice with skins and seeds. Um, that makes a difference in the winemaking style. All red wines are fermented as must, whereas white wines are just the juice. So when you have the skins and seeds together, that whole mixture is called must, M-U-S-T, and you ferment that to make wine. And then, of course, wine is the fermented, everything you just fermented that's the finished product, that is wine. So you take the juice or the must, you squeeze it, squish the berries, squish them up, and then you ferment and you get wine. Now that's the basic, way to say it, but there's a lot more to it than that. So we'll dive in. So we'll say at harvest, here's some things you need to really get through fermentation. First and foremost, you need a vat or a bucket or a bin. If you're small scale, buckets work just fine. If you're more on the commercial side, you probably want a big bin or a tank, something to hold a lot of juice or must. You need a refractometer and also a hydrometer. And if you get a hydrometer, you'll need a graduated cylinder. I know my little icon is probably in the way, but that top right photo that's a hydrometer with a graduated cylinder. And you need that as fermentation progresses because a refractometer is great for measuring sugars without alcohol. Once alcohol starts getting into the equation, a refractometer is not accurate anymore. The water density is different, and so the liquid density is different. So a refractometer doesn't work. You need to go to a hydrometer. So you can measure sugar with a refractometer up until harvest. Once you harvest and you start fermenting, you really need to switch to a hydrometer. A hydrometer is much more accurate when there's alcohol present. You'll also need a pH meter. That's probably the most important thing I'm going to say. You need to measure pH, the constant life of the wine. I mean, really, from harvest all the way until bottle, you should be measuring pH, or at least know where the pH is at. It makes a huge difference for microbial stability, for KMBS effectivity. That's potassium metabisulfite, and sulfites in wine. pH greatly influences sulfite effectiveness. And then, of course, you need yeast. You can ferment naturally. There's yeast present on the grapes all the time, but inoculating with commercial yeast usually gives you better results. Okay. So, ideal chemistry, fruit chemistry, that is. So at harvest, you measure sugars, pH, titratable acidity, YAN. This is the idea of chemistry. So at harvest, red wine making, you want a pH, you want those grapes, the grape berries, you want them at a pH between 3.4 and 3.8 with the Brix reading of 22 to 26. That's just the Brix scale. And then the TA of 4.0 to 6.0. Now those are ideal numbers. White wine, a little different. You want white wine a little more acidic, with a lower pH of 3.1 to 3.4. Brix will be the same because that's sugar. So sugar is a direct correlation to alcohol. The more sugar I have, the more alcohol I'm going to have. And the Brix scale see, that's a scale. It's a guy in Europe, I think it was France. His last name was Brix, invented the scale. It's 10 grams of sugar per liter. That is one brick. So if we have 22 bricks, we actually have 220 grams of sugar per 1 liter, you see. But this is just a simple way to see it. So bricks is the same, red or white, but you want a higher titratable acidity and you want lower pH on white wine making. Now, when you go to make white wine, you press first. You don't want any skins or any seeds. That will contribute to mouthfeel and give you tannin structure. So when you make a white wine, you want it a little more light, a little more crisp, and you really don't want to ferment on skins or seeds. If you know what you're doing, you can, but for the most part, you don't ferment with skins and seeds in white wine. That's why it's crisp. Okay, so that's just ideal chemistry. It's hard to hit all those numbers exactly, especially in Oklahoma. It gets really hot, and as bricks start to climb up, so does pH. So your pH might be 3.6, but your bricks is only 18. You probably don't want to harvest because you're not going to have very much alcohol. So you let your bricks, climb up into the 20s. Well, then your pH starts climbing up into 3.9, 4.0, and you just have to balance it. Where do you want to harvest? But ideally, this is the range you want. Okay. So the basic process for winemaking, we'll start with red wine. So we harvest, we crush, and we distim. And that's a equipment I'll explain later. And then you ferment. So now I've crushed the grapes, I've distimmed the grapes, you just throw the stems out. You don't need them, you can ferment with them, but it's just stylistic choice. Most of the time you throw them away. And you're left with the pulp, the must, you're left with the skins, the berries, the seeds, the juice all together, and you ferment that. You have to punch it down daily, which means the cap will rise. If you ferment with all that must, the berry skins float up to the top. You have to punch them down. And you have to do that daily. Twice a day is better. 3 times a day is great. After fermentation is complete, after about 2 weeks, you press and then you rack. And that you're just pressing all the skins out of the wine. It's wine now, and then you rack. Racking is a term to draw fresh wine off of lees. For white wine making, you press first because you don't want any skins or seeds. So if you go to harvest white grapes, you pick them from the vine, take them to your, processing wherever you are, and you press them. You just want juice. I just want straight juice with no skins or seeds in white wine. If I'm good enough, I'll even let that settle for a day, give it 24 hours, and then I'll rack off of that. You see? So everything will, with winemaking, things just settle out with time. It just with time things settle. So if you press first and then you put it in a holding tank for 24 hours, more stuff will settle out. You rack off of that, and then you ferment that really clean juice. That's going to be good white wine. And then you rack again. You'll rack many times throughout both winemaking processes. But that's the main difference. With red wine, you just crush, ferment everything together. With white wine, you press, throw away the skins and seeds, don't even use them. Get the juice. I just want clean, clear juice, and then I ferment that. Okay, some kinetics. Temperature for a red ferment, somewhere between 68 Fahrenheit to 85 Fahrenheit. Temperatures will climb up into the 90s. And then as the yeast do their job, as they just multiply and eat sugar and make alcohol, it warms up the ferment anyway. If you have a cold chiller or a very cold room, it helps. But temperatures will climb up into the 90s. You don't want it to get too hot, but anyway, 68 to 85 is ideal. For white ferments, you really want it colder. And this is where, glycol jackets and really a cooling tank is really beneficial because when you make white wine, if it gets too hot, all those aromatics will just blow out into the cellar, and they're not in your wine anymore. So when you ferment white wine, both wines really, when you ferment wine at too hot of a temperature, you lose aromatics. They just go away. So fermenting white really in the 50s and 60s is ideal. Length, anywhere from 10 to 21 days. Depends on the alcohol. I mean, it depends on the sugar. Depends on the sugars, the nitrogen level, the type of yeast. Some churn through fermentation slow, some zip through it pretty fast. It just all these make a difference, but you're somewhere between 10 days to 3 weeks, depending on what you're doing. And then the vats, like I say, vats is just a catch-all for any type of fermentation vessel. With a red ferment, you want a wide tank, a bin. Those are 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot macro bins. You want something wide and not too deep because you want a lot of skin contact with the juice. With a white ferment, you want tall and slender. You want to retain as much aromatics as possible, and you don't really need skin contact because there's no skins in there. So you can ferment a white tank or you can ferment a white wine in a tall, slender tank. That's kind of the what do you call it? The unwritten rule, I guess. So you want a not so deep semi-shallow, wide ferment for a red, and then you want a tall, slender vesicle for a white. And then that photo, you see the macrobins, you see the red must, you see the berry skins in there. And you see those guys with those tools and they're punching it. That's a punch down. You see, those skins float to the top, and you have to punch it down twice a day is, at least. I mean, at least once. You always want to do some sort of punch down, but twice a day is better. And you just incorporate the skin back into the juice, the must. You just incorporate it all, and then when it's finished, you press. Okay. Know what wine type you're making. So again, there's red, white, and then there's rosé, and then there's even sparkling. Again, red, you crush, ferment with the skins, and then you press. White wines, you always press first. I mean, unless you know what you're doing, like you're making some type of big bodied Chardonnay, you would leave the skins in there. But most of the time, we don't do that. Most of the time, we just press first. So whites, you press first, and then you ferment. A rosé. A rosé is a red grape made in the style of a white. So if you're making a rosé, you would take red grapes and then you just follow the white wine protocol. You press and then you just get the red juice and then you ferment it and it makes a lighter red. I mean, it's a rosé, you see. So that's how a rosé is made. And then a sparkling is a white based and then it's carbonated. I think there's maybe one or two, a couple. I mean, I don't even know that. Maybe one, maybe two sparkling producers in Oklahoma. You need some special equipment, and you really need to know what you're doing to make a sparkling wine. A lot of people just make a white base and then send it somewhere else to get carbonated. But anyway, those are the differences. And there they are in a glass. Okay, this is just kind of up close. On the left is a red ferment, and on the right is a white ferment. You see that's the difference. The red has the skin and seeds all together, everything. You just throw it in, ferment it. The white wine, you have just the juice. Yeah, I put this up here just to reiterate. You get more color from skin contact, you know. Okay. So on the thing of color, and I'm sorry if this icon's blocking the photo up there. But this just highlights how pH influences color. Um, well, skins. Red wine gets its color from the skins. There are a few exceptions where the mesocarp itself is red, but for most red grapes, it's actually the skin. So this kind of photo on the right explains that there's the exocarp, which is the skin, the mesocarp, which is the flesh pulp, that is the stuff you eat, and then the endocarp and the seed. Um, for the most part, the mesocarp is not red. So I mean, it's the mesocarp. It's the stuff that is the berry. It's usually not. It's usually translucent. It's only the skins that are red that gives it color. And then pH, like I say, you're not going to change the entire color of a wine depending on pH, but you will change the hue. Lower pH has a brighter hue, whereas a higher pH has kind of a duller, I put pink, but it's kind of duller red brick color hue. Now, if you get to a pH of 8.0, it will shift to blue, but you don't really have wine anymore. If the pH is 8.0, you got something else. So wine exists at a pH between 3 and 4, and the hue, it'll be a bright red, it'll be a dull red. It depends on pH. Okay, acid adjustments. Any questions real fast? No? Okay, I'll just keep going right along. So acids, specifically tartaric acid. There's three main acids in a grape. Like a grape from the vine will have tartaric acid, we'll have malic acid, and we'll have citric acid. Most of it is going to be malic, and then as you get later into harvest, tartaric starts to take off. But when you go to adjust acid in the winery, so we're actually in the cellar now, you mostly use tartaric acid. So tartaric acid can be used to lower pH and increase titratable acidity. 1 gram of tartaric acid in 1 liter of juice or wine will lower the pH by 0.1 units. If there is no buffer capacity, you really start getting into chemistry when you start saying things like this. Potassium in the wine affects buffer capacity. But anyways, 1 gram of tartaric acid in 1 liter will lower the pH by 0.1 units, you see. So a full 10 grams in 1 liter, one entire pH unit shift, or yeah, one entire unit. I also put here a little longhand formula for doing acid additions. So we'll follow it, drop down to the example line, the EX with the colon. So this is if your pH was at 3.9 and you want to shift it to 3.7, you multiply by 10, that's a constant, but then you multiply by your liters. You have to use liters because we're metric here. Uh, let's say you had 2,300 liters. You just run, so you take your initial pH minus your desired pH multiplied by 10 multiplied by your liters, and that tells you how many grams of tartaric acid you would need to add. So if I wanted to drop 2,300 liters by 0.2 units, I would add 4,600 grams of tartaric acid into that ferment. Um, do these additions in steps. I wouldn't add a full 4,600 grams at once. So I'd probably add 3,000 grams and then add the remaining, just like I say, buffer capacity things. You don't want to make huge decisions at once in winemaking. Make them step by step. And it's also best to make acid adjustments during fermentation. I don't know the exact science, and in fact, I don't think anybody really does. But when you make acid adjustments at fermentation, like when the wine, like you see during fermentation, it's way better than making them later. When you have a still wine, when the wine is finished and it's like, yeah, it's good wine, and then you make acid adjustment, it just doesn't take as well. I'm not sure what it is. I don't know, metabolic activity. There's something, it's one of those kind of the magic of it, I guess you would say. But acid adjustments at fermentation are usually best than post fermentation. Pressing. Um, this is something all wine needs to be done at some point. You have to press. If you're making from grapes, as you should. Um, So you need presses. Again, the icon's probably blocking the photo up there, but the top right photo is a horizontal press. If you're a commercial winery, you're probably getting into the horizontal press. You need those. If you're still small scale, a little basket press on the bottom right, and then even cheesecloth. I mean, if you're making just like a couple gallons, you could just press with cheesecloths. I've done that before. You just wrap the must, the grapes, you just squeeze. But a basket press is really helpful too. But any one of these is fine. You just need some type of press. You need a way to squeeze that juice out or squeeze that wine out. You see, if you're fermenting red wine, you have must. I got to squeeze the must. So, yep, pressing is something that will be done at some point. Okay, yeast. Let's get on. Let's talk about yeast. Any questions at all at this point? Oh, okay. I'll just keep going. We'll talk about different yeasts. So, yeast selection. Saccharomyces cerevisiae. That is the species. Saccharomyces, the genus, Cerevisiae, the species. This is what you want to use when you ferment wine. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the most common species of yeast used for wine fermentation. Now, there are many, many, many different strains of Saccharomyces cerevisiae to choose from, and sometimes you'll even find crosses. You'll find people cross different Saccharomyces with each other to create new strains. You just have to read and see what you like. But these are some common ones. AC 1118, NBC 71B, Alchemy, BDX. There's also QA23, all kind of different stuff. Essentially your flavors. You just have to go to Scott Labs, go to, I mean, wherever yeast is sold, read on there and see what you want. But I always recommend Saccharomyces cerevisiae. That's your golden standard. Each one of these yeast strains cleave different terpenes. They produce different thiols. The aromas you smell, the mouthfeel even. The yeast makes a difference in that. So you just have to research and experiment and find the ones you like. The yeast, like I say, yeast will select and affect your wine profile. This has to do with the yeast strain itself. The DNA makeup, the way a yeast works, the way it consumes sugar and cleaves plant terpenes and produces alcohol, that DNA mechanism that makes the yeast do that will affect the wine depending on the DNA mechanisms it has, you see. Um, and you can even mix different yeast together to create all kind of different stuff. Uh, People say a dominant strain will usually take over. Yeah, maybe that is true. A Saccharomyces yeast versus a native yeast like Hansinia spora or something, Saccharomyces will probably dominate, just take over. But you can get creative. Oh, there they are, native yeast. I'm getting one ahead of myself. So, like I say, natural native yeast is present on the berries right now. You can go into your vineyard, you can pick a grape, and then if you know what you're doing, you can isolate yeast. Like they're everywhere. They might be in your room right now. So they're present, and when you smash grapes and put them in a vat, they'll just kick off fermentation spontaneously, and that's because the native natural yeast that's present. So native yeasts usually include Hansinula, Pichia, Mechnicovia, Hansinia spora, Canidia. These are all, even Saccharomyces somewhere in the world was a native yeast, you see, but we've just through the centuries and millennia we've just found Saccharomyces to be really the best. So we've isolated Saccharomyces, cultivated Saccharomyces, and now Saccharomyces is the standard. So does that make sense? Everybody sees that? These are all different genus. These are different. They're not even species. They're different genus of yeast. They affect your ferments in different ways. So just FYI. Fermenting with native yeast can lead to some very different wine flavors and aromas. Native yeast tend to be less tolerant to alcohol, though. Some will be killed in as little as 2% alcohol. Some can survive 8, 9, maybe 10% alcohol. And but then you may co-inoculate with Saccharomyces. So this is a thing too. If you say, I want to do a natural ferment, I just want to see the natural flavors, like by all means, you ferment naturally. As alcohol starts to creep up, though, some of that native stuff just cannot tolerate it. So if you hit about 8% yeast or 8% alcohol, you might want to inoculate with Saccharomyces just to carry it out, to 13, 14, 15%, whatever your desired alcohol range is. Yeast rehydration. So if you were to, this has to do with commercial yeast. If you buy yeast online and have it shipped to your door, it's going to come in a dehydrated pack, like a brick. You see, it'll just be a big dehydrated brick of yeast. It ought to be rehydrated before using. So anyway, these are the steps to activate the yeast. You would get some hot water, specifically 104 Fahrenheit, 40 Celsius. And you pour the yeast in there, let it rehydrate for 20 minutes. Now, you have to measure the temperature of your ferment too. So let's say you have red must. I just crushed and I just destemmed and I got a tank of red must I'm ready to inoculate. If that must is at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, but my yeast activation slurry solution is at 104 Fahrenheit, that's too big of a temperature difference. I need to let that yeast slowly cool down to about 85 and then inoculate it. So measure the temperature of the yeast slurry, measure the temperature of your fermented vat, and then they need to be within 15 degrees of each other. So I said, I hope that makes sense to your brain. So yeast will come as a dehydrated brick. You have to activate it with warm water. But as you activate it, you have to remember that the yeast temperature of the yeast slurry solution that is about to throw into my tank has to be within 15 degrees Fahrenheit of my ferment. You see, if I put hot yeast into a cold vat, it won't take off. So FYI. Yeast nutrient. Okay, yan. This is something we always hear about. Well, I hope you're hearing about it at least. It's yeast assimilable nitrogen. So along with sugar, just regular 6-carbon glucose, fructose sugar, yeast also needs nitrogen, specifically ammonia, ammonium, and free amino nitrogen. The yeast need nitrogen for growth and reproduction. If a ferment does not have yan, the yeast will not work. They have nothing to grow on. They have sugar, but they need nitrogen as well. Nitrogen is even more limiting than sugar. Well, I guess both are pretty limiting, but for growth and colonization, you need nitrogen. Measuring yan is difficult. Um, if you have a Vinmetrica, that's probably your best bet. You can buy a little yan testing kit and plug it into your Vinmetrica and measure yan that way. If you don't have a Vinmetrica, you have to do a formal titration, which is cumbersome and sort of dangerous. It includes formaldehyde. I've done it before just to do it, but I really don't recommend it. The Vinmetrica is probably your best bet. Um, but with that too, if you can measure yan, if you can somehow measure the nitrogen in your fermentation vessel, it goes a long way for yeast nutrients. Proper yan ranges somewhere between 150 milligrams a liter to 300 milligrams a liter. Okay, yeast nutrients. So this is what you use to feed your yeast. If your yan is low, let's say you did measure yan and it's like, man, the yan's only 70 milligrams per liter. That's not enough. You're not going to get through fermentation. So you'd have to supplement with some yeast assimilable nitrogen, such as Fermate O, Fermate K, or diammonium phosphate. Feeding yeast during fermentation will help the yeast churn through the fermentation. You see, they're going to use this as growth. This is supplemental nutrients for them. But also, what feeds good yeast will also feed spoilage yeast, and you just need to be aware of that. So you don't just want to, oh, well, let me just throw an extra scoop in here, just to feed it. I mean, sure, but you're also, if any bad microbes pop up, you're going to be feeding those bad microbes too. You see, so you just got to be careful. You want to create a nutrient desert. You want to provide enough food that the yeast will get through fermentation, but as they end, you want them to run out. You see, so you don't want any nitrogen, any yan left over post fermentation. However much sugar they're going to churn into alcohol, that's how much yan ideally you want them to have. You want them to get enough nitrogen that they grow and consume all the sugar. And then once there's no more sugar, ideally in a perfect world, you want them to run out of nitrogen too, you see. And then fermentation will end, the yeast will die and drop to the bottom of the tank. Your wine is now made. You then rack or press, and then you take care of your wine from there on out. So any questions on nutrients? I'll just keep going. This is a little graph I made. It just shows relative amounts and relative lengths. There's no hard numbers here. The blue line is the yeast, the red line is nitrogen, and the green line is sugar. So as you see, the bottom left far corner, we'll say, is inoculation. That's when you start the fermentation. So the very bottom left corner is we're starting fermentation right now. I just inoculated my tank. There's going to be a 1 day or 2 day lag phase where the yeast are just like waking up, from their hydration. They're getting, oh, I'm in a sugar solution now. I need to start colonizing and reproducing and eating sugar. That's a 1 to 2 day lag phase. And then after that, there's an exponential growth. The yeast take off, they colonize, they're eating all the sugars in sight, they're making alcohol, and that'll last, 1 or 2 weeks. They'll peak, they'll hit stationary phase, and you see right as they peak, that's when they run out of nitrogen. So when they stop growing, they're no longer building their colony. They've maxed out. There's what's called stationary phase, and that you're just going to ride that until you run out of sugar. And once you run out of sugar, the yeast die because they have nothing to eat anymore. So that's how fermentation works. You see nitrogen, I mean, sugar and nitrogen are your limiting both. You need both, but you won't have any colonization growth. You won't have any real reproduction if you don't have nitrogen. And then you won't have. So that's just kind of how they work. Okay, yeast. We're getting into MLF now, but yeast is primary alcoholic fermentation. Bacteria is secondary or malolactic fermentation. So we just covered yeast. I think we're going to get into bacteria now. Yeah, bacteria. Okay. Bacteria and yeast are fundamentally different. They're in complete different kingdoms, you see. So malolactic fermentation requires bacteria. You need good bacteria. MLF, as it's called, is the conversion of malic acid into lactic acid. Malic acid is crisp. Think of a Granny Smith apple. Like that's just malic acid, that tart, very crisp malic acid. Lactic acid is soft. Think of cream or milk or butter. You see, if you can, that's lactic acid. That's a very softer mouthfeel. Um, so malic acid is present in the grapes. You harvest the grapes, there's malic acid there. If I want a creamy, smooth, buttery mouthfeel, I want to convert that malic acid into lactic acid, and I have to do that using a lactic acid bacteria, which we'll talk about here. So lactic acid bacteria for winemaking, there's three main genera. Enococcus, Pediococcus, and Lactobacillus. Enococcus is definitely the most commonly used in winemaking. If you go to the grocery store and you look on the back of yogurts, you'll usually find Lactobacillus. You see, yogurt requires bacteria. Good winemaking requires bacteria. So all these bacteria are commercially available. But like I say, if you want to convert malic acid into lactic acid, you need one of these bacterias. And that's totally a stylistic choice. There's no right or wrong. So you just think about your wine and the direction you're trying to go. So the decision to take a wine through MLF is completely stylistic by the winemaker. There's no right or wrong. A good candidate for malolactic fermentation is a high acid wine. You see, if you just have a red wine, you're like, man, it's just way too acidic. Put it through MLF. Most red wines do go through MLF. I think every red wine benefits, and I'll say every red wine. I mean, yeah, all red wines benefit. In my opinion, that's just my palate from MLF. Very few whites, a Chardonnay or a Viognier, um, go through MLF. You see, it just has to do with style. If you want a light, crisp wine, don't take it through MLF. But if you want something kind of buttery, kind of creamy, kind of soft, take it through MLF. You see? So completely up to you, completely stylistic choice. And also MLF can take months to complete. That's the way the bacteria works. Yeast churn through fermentation in just a couple weeks, but malolactic fermentation, that conversion of malic acid to lactic acid takes months. It can take anywhere 6 weeks to 4 months, just depending on the wine, the chemistry, your cellar. If it's a very cold cellar, it's going to take longer. Warmer temperatures will get it through there quicker, but it'll still take a minimum of 6 weeks. Post fermentation. Okay, I think we're kind of wrapping up towards the end here. So post fermentation, we fermented everything. It's done. What do we do? We have wine now, right? Almost. You still have to clarify it, age it, filter it. But once fermentation is complete, the main goal is clarity, preservation, and just age. Of course, we all know red wine usually benefits from a couple years of age, and they go into oak barrels for that. But even then, so let's say you ferment and go straight into barrel, you're not totally done. You still have to clarify. You'll pull it back out of barrel, clarify it, put it back in, check potassium metabisulfite, all that. So with that, don't forget to use potassium metabisulfite. I've done a whole presentation on potassium metabisulfite. It's essentially a preservative that you use in winemaking. Camden tablets are store-bought. That's the same thing. But if you're a professional, just buy bags and bags and bags of KMBS because you'll use it the whole life of the wine. KMBS shuts down microbial growth, you see. So once fermentation is complete, you're done. You're done with alcoholic fermentation. You're done with secondary fermentation. I'm not doing anything else more to this wine in terms of microbial activity. Use KMBS because it shuts down microbes. You see, wine will spoil very, very quickly if you don't know what you're doing. So do use KMBS to help shut down unwanted microbial growth. I guess I put this in there because the barrels, but all red wines do well with some oak. I think just me and my palate, the way I like wine, all reds benefit from MLF and they all benefit from oak. I just think it's something we found as a society through millennia and centuries of winemaking. Red wines are good with oak. So do oak your reds, but you don't have to, but I think you should. Okay, and I think that brings us to the end. I'll quit the recording and we'll open it up to some Q&A. Thank you.